Hello, my name is Rissa Jackson, and this is my podcast, Ripples. Joining me are my guests, Greg and Michael. Welcome to episode 7.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Hey, Rissa. All right, how's it going, Rissa? You've had a busy few months, year even.
Yeah, it's going great. It's definitely been pretty busy. I would say that this part of the year has been particularly busy. Laracon Europe and Laracon India were kind of just like on each other's heels. And now there's like a bit of a break before Laracon US, but definitely it felt like a lot in between them and afterwards, just kind of recovering.
It's good that you get the break and you can really set yourself in the headspace for what will be, I guess, the biggest. Laracon India is the biggest by attendance Laracon that
Hmm.
there is, but I think Laracon US is still holds the title. Obviously being the premier Laracon, being like the biggest in terms of, I don't want to say expectation, but in terms of like the experience of the people um, that attend and things like that. So it's very very cool that you went from being hesitant to submit to speak at Laracon AU to now being on your way, like I think 4 short months away now from doing the full Grand Slam of all of the Laracons in your first year as well, which is an incredible achievement. Congratulations for that.
Thank you. Yeah, it sort of just came together, but obviously Laracon Australia was a really fantastic start to it. And I also think it was like a really nice kind of way to get started with Laracons. Like if anyone's like thinking about trying it out, Laracon Australia is a fantastic way to start because it's a little bit smaller, but I feel like then you get to like know everyone even more and it's a little less intimidating. And I think you as an organizer do a really fantastic job making it easy for first time speakers. And so I'm really glad I started there. I know some people start with Laracon US or Laracon India, and I think both of those sound like very intimidating ways to start. But I guess if you get it out of the way, you're good also, and you know it can't get worse or scarier.
That's right. Yeah, it can't get scarier than taking the stage there. And I know that there've been a few people that have spoken there sort of once and then not spoken again in like the following year, or they've taken a couple of years off, or they just haven't spoken um, again. So whether that's, sometimes you work yourself up to the big idea, the big thing that gets your break at Laracon US, but you don't like the follow up is hard. Greg's going through
Hmm.
that at the moment a little bit with AU as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
Before we open speaker submissions, Greg, you had like all of these ideas, and it's kind of really boiled down to one main one for you now, I think, hasn't it?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, there's still a couple of other ones kicking around, but I don't know about you, Rissa, but I find that ideas are kind of reasonably easy. Like you can sort of like come up with an abstract for a few things you might be able to talk about, but then you think about it for a little while, and then only a few of those kind of coalesce into anything that you think that you could speak in a semi-compelling way for half an hour. So yeah, it's I think I had 3 or 4 sort of basic ideas, and then one of them sort of fell out of that. Still working on hopefully get one more submission in before submissions close. But how have you come up with 4? Well, it'd be 5 talks because you did Laracon online as well, didn't you?
I did Laracon online. I will say that I got a little bit of a pass on submitting talks because Laracon India was kind enough to let me redo my Laracon Europe talk, which
Hmm.
honestly I really needed to be able to repeat a talk because there's like barely like there's a bit more but barely more than a month between them, and like
Mm.
Hmm.
going from one and then just immediately starting planning on another talk, and then going on that travel and trying to speak like jet lagged and everything.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine a way where I could do justice to that, and so I was really grateful they let me redo it. But so far, besides that, I've been doing different talks for each, and you're right, like there's like a lot of ideas out there and it's good to maybe explore them a bit, but I also think sometimes people get really hung up on this concept of like I have to have this talk like figured out before I submit it, and I don't agree with that. I think that have like a good, 30 minutes or maybe a bit more where you think it through and are like, I could really do this, and I have, some concept of a framework for this talk, but submit talks that are not like fully baked, because you don't know what the organizer's looking for. Are they looking for another tech talk? Are they looking for another soft skills talk? Are they just wanting a different topic in general? And honestly, usually when I submit talks, I don't know what I'm going to say, but as I'm preparing the talk, like I learn more about that topic. I learn what my angle is. And I think that can be like a really cool way to force yourself to learn something that you kind of know and reinforce it and maybe just teach yourself better. Like I don't think you need to be an expert when you submit a talk on this idea.
Yeah, I think that's something that's overlooked by people looking to submit their first talk. Something that we say in the Laravel community, especially, is that the best time to teach a topic is when you're learning it for the first time. It is very hard to put yourself in the mindset of like how did I feel, how did I approach this thing that I learned a year ago. Like it's hard to do that, and there are exceptionally talented people out there that can. But I think if you're looking to break into speaking, then certainly it's something that like teach something that you're in the moment. It might be something new that you something that's new in the framework that you're just learning for the first time or picking up for the first time, or some technology that's kind of around the edges. But from my perspective as a conference organizer, I don't need you to have like a fully fleshed out. I don't assume that you have a talk at the time that you submit. I assume that you've got an idea, and when you submit, we make it really easy. We ask for a title and an abstract, and that's really it. We ask a couple of auxiliary questions so we know, we've got a certain budget allocated, so we know that we can get a certain number of speakers from overseas, a certain number have to come from Australia. And so we ask for like where you're coming from. But other than that, like a title and an abstract is really all that we need. And it's your job in like a few sentences to a paragraph to sell what that idea is. And then once you submit it, we will review it and we'll give you plenty of time. The submissions for Laracon Australia are open until the middle of May. So you will have, from May until November to really flesh that out. And so, having a portfolio of talks is good if you're going to be like speaking a lot. I think in Laracon, it's more difficult if you're going to try and give the same talk at different Laracons. It's going to get better the more you give it. Sure, you're going to add bits and pieces, you change bits that don't work, things like that. But because of the public nature of those conferences, Europe, US, Australia, I don't know if India records, but like the talks are recorded. So the trick is if you're going to give another version of the same talk, lots of people in that audience will have seen it. It's okay to shop that talk around, I think, between conferences. If you've got something that's, not Laravel specific and you can give it at different conferences, that's totally fine. We bring in speakers from other events because, they're good speakers and those things kind of translate into our community. But I don't mind if those have been recorded because it's unlikely that there's an overlap between those communities, but it's hard in our community to do the same talk at multiple Laracons, I think.
Yeah, I when I submitted last year, I think I've told the story a few times. It was just an off the cuff sort of abstract, but I was relatively confident that I could speak on that topic. So I guess when I'm sort of talking about ideas coalescing, it's more like, am I confident that I could turn a one paragraph abstract into a compelling like 30-minute talk? And like I think I could do that once a year. I think that's definitely possible. But it's pretty amazing to be like a sort of first time or coming up on fourth time speaker and just doing that in your first year, being able to come up with what's going to end up being 3 separate talks. Although the one in India, even though it was like a repeat of the one in Europe, I'm imagining you made some tweaks and changes along the way. It wouldn't have been a straight carbon copy.
It wasn't. I would say that I had a lot more ambitions for changes, and then we all got super sick. I'm sure some of that news came out. I believe that they talked about that on No Plans to Merge, and I think I heard my name on that podcast about us all getting sick. But because of how sick we were, I didn't really feel confident going with like a lot of the changes I had planned. And so I had to stick a bit more to kind of the script. Like I still made some changes and some tweaks, and I liked a lot of the changes ultimately, but honestly, like I felt like I wasn't fully there because I hadn't slept much. I was jet lagged and like sick. And like before my talk, I was just laying backstage, like trying to make sure I didn't like, go on stage and like throw up or something. And I was just like, okay, we can do this. So it was definitely
How
a
did and
challenge.
how did that go when you then walked onto stage to a room full of people screaming your name? That did that help or hinder?
It was really helpful. It was so kind. Like, I feel like Vishal was like trying to, like, he saw how like awful I was backstage, and I
Mhm.
feel like he was like trying to hype me up. And honestly, I like was building off that energy, and I was like, okay, like I feel like good enough to get on the stage, and like there's this wonderful group of people who are supportive and are happy to be here, and like I want to do the best job I can do for them. And yeah, I was really grateful for that. And also, like, how many times you get to have a room full of people chant your name? It's a pretty fun experience.
Yeah, like 1,000 of them. That was I saw that video and I was like, that is certainly certainly something. Like it is either going to hype you up or it's going to scare the crap out of you. So I'm glad that it served only to hype you up for your talk.
Yeah, definitely. So ultimately, sometimes you kind of have to just go back to what you've done before. Things change. But I do think that there are benefits to getting to repeat a talk because you get to make those changes that you had in mind and remember the things that you walk off stage and you're like, I didn't say that thing. And you can
Mhm.
go back. But also, it's delightful to come up with something new for the community and keep them guessing. Like Laracon US will be a brand new talk, and I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I think the only person who perennially runs the same talk that I can think of is Stephen Reese Carter, but the talk's always called the same thing, but it's always full of it's always full of new and surprising ways to terrify people. um, yeah, so first year speaker, you're it's probably fair to say sort of a bit more early career than some of us who've been sort of around for a while.
Don't say it.
How how have you found that in terms of like it's like I think it's pretty incredible to sort of get all of these opportunities and have a community that's willing to support people who are at the early stage of your career. I mean, we have spoken to a lot of people who have been around for a really long time. It'd be interesting to get your sort of perspective, sort of from where you are in your career around that journey.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think like it's really fun to be new to this field because there's a lot of things that I am just learning that I get to share. And instead of assuming that like this is stuff everyone's heard before, like maybe I get a chance to, it's new to me and I get to share it like it's new, whether it is or not. But that does lead to some really delightful experiences with imposter syndrome. There are multiple times where I'm preparing a talk and it's like, who am I to talk about this? Like, there's got to be someone better out there. And there's that concept of like, I'm not an expert at this. Why am I the one talking? And I've had people much more experienced than me mention, feeling like not an expert about something, they shouldn't give a talk. And because I feel like I'm not an expert at anything, being so new to this field, I've been here almost 4 years professionally, which is pretty new. I'm not an expert at anything, so sometimes it's also freeing because I know everyone could possibly be better at doing this, but I don't think the point of the talk is to be the expert or to be like the voice to talk about it. I'm just giving my take on it, and maybe my take works for someone. I've seen a lot of tweets recently talking about, even if you've seen something before, or even if someone's already doing something, still do it. Maybe the way you say it will resonate with someone. And I think that is something that everyone should take into account if you're wanting to submit to a Laracon or to just a tech conference in general, and you're thinking, oh, someone's already talked about this, or I can't be the expert on it. Maybe the way that you interpret things, maybe the way you learn things is going to be the key that unlocks things for people, and use that as a superpower instead of something to stop you.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree 100% with that. And that's something that's a phrase that I always go back to, and something that I think you and I have a common mentor on that in Matt Stauffer, where that was always a line of his, is that your perspective, your take may be the one that resonates, and don't let learning something, being in the moment, stop you from sharing that perspective. As I said earlier, it's very difficult for someone who is an expert to put themselves into a beginner's shoes and teach something in such a way that they will grasp it. Um, there are very few people that are good at that. So it's always important, I think, for anyone and everyone to share that. And if the excitement comes through in your abstract that you're ready to talk about it, someone that's been doing something for 10 years, 15 years, they don't have the excitement for it necessarily. That's someone that's like, this thing, form request, like creative ways to use form requests. Like for everyone else, it's like, yeah, I just use a form request because it encapsulates logic. But there are crazy things that you can do with them that someone who doesn't quote unquote know better, that they might be doing the wrong thing, or whatever, whatever those subjective points of view are. I don't know. It's just, look at this cool thing that I did with a form request kind of story. So um, but you say you've only been at this for 4 years, and I was sure at some point you worked at Titan. So that was like your first or second role. You were only there for a short time.
That was my second role, and I was there for a year, and there were really fantastic people there. So smart. I mean, yeah, you mentioned Matt Stauffer, and then there were just wonderful people. I was working there when Susanna was working there, and it was wonderful to get to work with her. And she's mentioned on her stage, like being mentored by Sarah Vine, and
Mhm.
I have also gotten the opportunity to be mentored by her. And there's just a lot of really fantastic, super smart people there.
So what was the journey? Because you didn't study computer science. You taught English in China or something for a while. Is that right?
Oh yeah, good memory. Um, so let's see. I've had a couple different chapters. I taught English in China for 2 years, and then I was going back to school and studying international relations in Chinese, which is very different from programming. And while I was working towards that, I realized that the job opportunities for that, wow, could be interesting, were not quite fitting what I wanted for my life. And so I pivoted to studying computer science. I got a computer science certificate, which is kind of like a minor. I don't know if that's something that is understand.
Hmm.
Okay, something
Yep.
you get in
Understand.
Australia.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. Um, And so, going into the job market and just being like, I don't have a degree, but I have some hours and, I'm excited to learn. Definitely challenging, especially, 2020. Even then, it wasn't like a super kind market to new developers, junior developers, which is kind of why I wanted to do that talk at Laracon Australia about like junior developers and how to like set them up for success. And I'm really excited you let me do that talk because I've been wanting to do it for ages. But I like one thing you said about being closer to beginners, and I do think that is a superpower that I get to have. I learned programming as an adult, and there's a lot of people who have been doing it since they were 10, 18, a long, long time, and they know programming inside and out. But because it's newer to me, I do think that gives me the benefit of being able to talk to newer developers and really understand where they're coming from, because I remember not understanding loops. I understand, not understanding frameworks and functions and just all these things that like some of us take for granted after a while. Like I'm just like, oh yeah, I remember how confusing that was, and so that can be a way that I can connect with people. And same with talking. But I would also say like talking to non-technical stakeholders, like these are superpowers, and a lot of
Yeah.
people don't realize that people who pivot into tech or join tech later in life bring some of these superpowers along with them.
Challenges are my career has kind of moved on to managing people, and the instinctive thing to do when you pull a graduate or a junior onto a team is to pair them up with the most experienced person that you've got, because surely this person is going to drag this poor newbie kicking and screaming into productivity. And one of the interesting things that I read about quite recently is around the around who best to pair together to learn. And sometimes the super expert is the wrong person because whilst they know about stuff, they've internalized everything so much that they can no longer explain it. They can't, loops work because loops work. I would struggle to explain like the constituent parts of a loop because like I've done it so many times, and that can be deeply frustrating, not only for the junior who is, asking legitimate questions that to an expert sound very silly. And it's almost, I've seen cases where I've had senior engineers almost doing the sort of Homer Simpson, Bart Simpson strangling by the neck. Why don't you understand this thing? And I think sort of having, slightly more experience, like sort of mid-career engineers or junior engineers coaching graduate engineers and mid-career engineers coaching junior engineers. And then when people start to internalize these things more and become experts and want to sort of elevate themselves to, or sort of like that sort of transcendent state of sort of just knowing things, that's the time when sort of putting them with the master kind of thing is where it makes a lot of sense. And like that concept makes a lot of sense to me when I sort of think about it now. But yeah, I think you're sort of right that matching people who understand things, who are closer to the business, who are probably closer to understanding things that non-technical stakeholders are, and closer to understanding, have the very real memory of what it was to be very confused about things is really, really useful.
Yeah, I am very cognizant of that now with like a 3-year-old who speaks but like doesn't know how to read yet, and a 5-year-old who is learning to read in school. And it's like, I learned to read 30 years ago. I don't know how to teach someone to read. And they're coming back, and there's all of this stuff. They're talking about phonics and learning sounds and getting, individual letters and sounding them out and then joining the sounds together to form words. And it's just, if you put that into a programming context, like Greg suggested, if I had to explain to someone how a control structure works or a loop works, I don't know. It was that long ago that I learned it. It's just foundational to my understanding of programming. But in terms of like how this works, I couldn't explain it. It's something that you've either got to be a teacher or you've got to be really close to that point in your career where you understand that kind of stuff. So I'm glad that Eli's got good teachers, because when I was trying to teach him before he started school, it was kicking and screaming.
The really funny thing is there's a 3-year gap between my two kids, and Madeline was about to enter prep, which was like I guess kindergarten or preschool or whatever it might be. I don't know what you'd call it in the US. And Chloe, knowing that she was going to learn to read, started teaching her to read. And I'm just watching this kid who's like in grade 2 teaching someone who's about to go into prep how to read. And I'm just like, that's astonishing. Like, because I like you, I couldn't teach Chloe to read.
Yeah.
Read through repetition and things, maybe like she could sort of pretend to read because she knew what the story was, but I don't think she was actually doing
and
it.
That's
and yeah, it's there's definitely like huge, not to sort of sound like we're calling junior engineers children. But yeah, I think it's principally the same kind of idea. There's so much stuff that we just take for granted that's almost no longer in our brains. It's completely at our fingertips.
Yeah.
And it's really easy, I think, for late career people to just assume that they can say, use a constructor here. Well, what's a constructor?
Yeah. Yeah. It constructs the thing. But I mean, and technology is even more than like learning to read, changes
Hmm.
rapidly. We went to an information night at the school, and there were parents in there who had kids in like second and third grade, where Eli's in prep in reception, and they're saying, "What is all this stuff?" Like even in that short span of time between like their first child coming through reception and their second child, things had changed enough that they didn't know what was being taught, how it was being taught. So we are extremely susceptible to that in tech because things change and move. Like fundamentals don't change, but like where people are learning. When I went to
Hmm.
university, it was Java. People learned C before me. Now there's a lot of JavaScript being taught, but there's still Java. There's still Java being taught in universities and stuff. It's
Hmm.
like, yeah, cool, but there's not like enterprisey stuff, sure, but it's not approachable to new people necessarily. So yeah, it's interesting.
I think the other thing that's interesting to remember, um, and you're right about the sort of foundational stuff. I mean, the foundational stuff probably isn't going to change unless there's some massive revolution around the corner. But we tend to think of people as being senior engineers, staff engineers, principal engineers, those kinds of things. But I don't think anyone, unless they're very, very good, understands everything. Like we're all sort of junior or graduate at something at all times if we're continuing to learn. So um, yeah, there's something sort of in that you can be an expert at a thing, and then completely lost on
Yeah.
something else. So yeah, I did really enjoy your talk at Laracon AU because it gives a gave me a lot of reflection on, well, actually, like she's completely right about all of this stuff, and
Hmm.
we need to be kinder to our new people because they're the next group of people who are going
Next
to come
group,
through.
yeah.
Like they're in 5 to 10 years time, they're going to be sort of where we are, and they're going to, I think how we treat them is going to influence how they treat the next cohort of people that are
Hmm.
coming up behind them.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of when I was growing up, when you say why, it's like it's because I said so. It's because the way it is. It's whereas now it's like we should embrace those kinds of questions. Why do you do this? It's not because this is how it's done. It's maybe the new person is trying to or maybe they do understand it, but they go, well, why are we doing it this way and not another way? So those perspectives really do help in an organization. And if you haven't seen Rissa's talk from Laracon, you check it out. It was as Greg said, it was good to reflect inwardly, but it was thought provoking as well. So, Rissa, what is on the horizon? Like you're going to complete this Grand Slam in your inaugural year. Are you gonna take a second lap? Are you going to take a break? Are you going to be more selective about which conferences you submit to? It's like it's something to keep up with, and a fresh talk at every event that you speak at.
Yeah, it's a great question. I definitely hope to continue talking at least at some more Laracons. I did send some more submissions to Laracon Australia today before this chat because I was like, I've been meaning to send more, and this is a great deadline to push me to do some more. I had a really fantastic time in Australia, and I'd love to go back if possible. But yeah, I guess probably it's tough to do all four all the time. And I highly doubt that they want that all the time either. I'm sure they want to give new people a chance and keep, the lineup changing sometimes. But it's such a fantastic way to meet the Laravel community in other parts of the world. And I love seeing how similar and different it can be. Obviously India could be very different from the US or Australia, but they also are just very excited, just as the other communities are. And it's lovely to see that even if the culture can be quite different, we're all kind of connected by this shared love and this shared language that we can talk about and be able to immediately connect on. And I would definitely love to go to some more. We'll see how many will happen. I do think that at some point it's tough to keep coming up with new things to talk about. But also it's kind of a fun challenge. Like, what's not been covered, or what could I bring something new to? You mentioned earlier about trying to remember my thought from earlier about explaining why we do things. And I wanted to just touch on that briefly. I think one thing that gets missed a lot, especially in classes or just in organizations, is why certain things solve problems. Like, just for example, like REST APIs. A lot of people have been in tech, and developers for a long time understand what it was like without that, or, without Bootstrap for CSS. Like, there's all these problems that you saw, and then you saw them get solved by these things. And I think for new people, we didn't see the problems. We're just seeing the solutions in this void. And it's really helpful to think back to what problems these solved, and maybe start talking to juniors about that. And so I just wanted to touch on that briefly, because I think that juniors get to take for granted these solutions, but they also don't get to understand the history. And as people who have been working in tech a long time, I think you are holding a lot of history that you can bring to juniors.
Knowing the problem, I think, is often very, very, like, if you just tell someone what the solution to a problem is, you get no creativity, you get no advancement. And if you explain the problem to somebody and then show them, this was the problem, this is our current best understanding of how to solve that. I think the older I get, the more kind of rusted on I get. I actually need to deliberately and consciously decide to try new things, because I've done things, they work. I keep doing the things that work. And I think there's another, by explaining the problem, like you say, to people, when they're like fresh and their brains are like sponges and they just want to like take things in and learn. I've learnt things from people who are in earlier parts of their career precisely because of that, precisely because they don't have their brain just loaded up with a whole bunch of recipes that they can throw at problems that look sort of roughly the same shape. So that's, I think that's definitely like a super important point.
I just thought of like a really good example. So I really take for granted GitHub and version control. I don't remember a time programming before this. And I just spoke to a developer recently, and his company still doesn't use version control. They don't use Git. And I'm just like, but then what do you do? Like, I just I can't even envision it almost. And I'm
You don't want the answer to that question.
And I'm sure, not necessarily all of us have experience of a time before, but I'm sure you know that there are worse, paths out there, or worse, companies that you've worked for because they were before some of these tools that I take for granted, and I don't understand the problems this is solving.
Subversion. I don't think Git solved the version control problem, but it did solve the subversion problem.
Yes.
And be very, very thankful that you've never run into that. If you haven't run into that, that was the worst. Yes. Merging subversion branches was like hell.
Yeah, back then. And then, in the transition period between subversion and Git was all of this SVN to Git stuff, and trying to push subversion repositories into Git so that you could start to make the transition. But all the senior developers then were rusted onto SVN, and the people before that it was CVS, and then there was this mercurial phase. I started to watch a talk the other day from one of the co-founders of GitHub, and the first thing he said to the audience was who here has ever used something other than Git? And if the number of hands in that room is more than or less than 10, you're in trouble. That's where you start to feel real old.
In the edit, I think Michael's going to just put that sort of overlay of the Vietnam flashbacks. Yeah, but I mean, there's a really, I don't know whether or not you came across this in your research for your talk or not, but I do recall an anecdote from an Uncle Bob talk years ago where the number of software developers is roughly doubling every 5 years.
Wow.
So that means that if you've got 5 years of experience, you're in the 50%. There's twice as many people who are less experienced than you, and that's a really sort of humbling thing, I think.
Didn't we find out a bunch of people at the last Laracon Australia were like pretty new? What was?
Yeah, I think it was like 60% of people were what we would like had 2 years or less of experience. I think just not so much new developers, but first time attendees. I know that was fairly
Mhm.
consistent. Laracon EU was 80% first timers. Laracon US had, I think, a big turnout of first time attendees. We were 65, 70% were first timers. So um
Be interesting to see if COVID had anything to do with that.
yeah, like
People
people
were really like hanging out to come to a Laracon, and then all of them had to
and
stop.
then yeah, and so I think part of that is people that were wanting to and then couldn't, and part of it was that during that COVID time, people lost their jobs or people changed
Mhm.
jobs or whatever else, and so they went and explored other opportunities, and I think we lost a lot of PHP people, a lot of Laravel people. They went and they started learning Go or Rust or TypeScript, that kind of stuff. They went into those other communities, and so obviously the Laravel community is still vast and you know, there's lots of people involved in it. But I think a lot of the senior people they find they go and do other things eventually. So it'll be interesting to see what the demographic looks like this year. And I'll do a much better job of capturing that information this time around.
So I think we're pretty close to wrapping up. Did you have any last thoughts for us, Rissa? Putting you on the spot now.
Let's see. I thinking back to like my talk at Laracon Australia, I do really like in your talk, Greg, when you talked about, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. That was, I think, referencing the like Atomic Habits book. Yeah. I think that's something that like everyone can kind of learn from. And I think it's particularly relevant for junior developers. If you have vast goals of like they are going to be awesome and they're going to have a great time and be your future rock stars, but you don't have any systems to set them up for success, or you don't have any plan for how they're going to get there, you're gonna maybe not have the outcome you're looking for. And maybe similarly with speaking at tech conferences, if that's a goal for you and you're not applying to them and you're not giving them maybe multiple talks to choose from, you're not really setting yourself up for success. So create a system, keep track of your talk ideas and flesh them out and keep applying and find ways to, bring your systems up so that you can reach your goals.
Yeah, for sure.
Love it.
So, I think we're close to wrapping up. This has been really great, Rissa. This is we've been talking about having you on for a little while, and really thankful that you jumped on. If anyone else would like to speak to us, you can find us in all the usual places. And if you want to have a crack at emulating Rissa's Grand Slam, it doesn't matter where you are in your career, just start submitting. The season of Laracon starts in Brisbane in November. We've unilaterally decided that that's when the Laracon year starts.
That's right.
Not self-serving at all.
Well, and we need to make sure to give Aaron Francis a shout out. I feel like he's supposed to get one at least once per episode, and 100%. you have to put yourself out there and share your work to increase your luck, and we'll definitely connect that to the ripples. I loved your talk, Michael, opening up the Laracon Australia with talking about the ripples that you put out into the world. And so keep
I may have
publishing,
made
keep sharing.
Oh no, I may have made a terrible mistake.
That's true.
I don't
what are
think
you
this
gonna do?
year's welcome. Yeah, I don't think this year's welcome is going to be anywhere near as impactful as that one.
He's shot his shot. It's all downhill from here.
I'll make up with it with fancy theatrics.
I would love to see you just like bring out a video on stage of last year's talk and just being like that.
That again. Let's do this again. We have the final branding. Like I received the final branding stuff yesterday, so we are going to build on the messaging from last year for sure. There will be a distinct theme for 2024, and I look forward to sharing that in the next week or two.
Can't wait to see it.
Well, until next time, I've been Greg.
I have been Michael.
I've been Rissa, and thanks for joining for episode 7 of my podcast, Ripples.
Goodbye.